Hello there, lovely folks of YouTube. Ren here. I am on a selfie stick in my bedroom. I hope this doesn't turn out awful, but yes. Hi. Look, it's Hades. There's Hades. And look, on the other side of me is Persephone. I am flanked by black cats. Anyway, I don't have a lot of good spaces in my home when people are home in which to record videos in, so I'm here. I'm here in my bedroom. Here in my bedroom, I'ma make videos. Anyway, there were some requests to do some stuff on garden planting, and this is the right time of year for it. So I have my little notes here on my lap. Let's see if we can get Hades to not walk all over them, and yeah, we'll do it. Let's do it. So wintertime, this time of year, particularly like January, is really the time that everybody's, at least if you're in the northern hemisphere, you're going to be planting a garden. Planning like, what do you want to plant? Where do you want to put it? You know, if you're new to gardening, it can seem really overwhelming, just kind of like, where do I even start? Where do I even know where to begin? So I like to think of garden planning as following, the thing you want to keep in mind is the four elements, okay? So the four classic Greek elements, of course, are fire, water, earth, and air. Those are four things that we need to keep in mind when we're planting our garden. So fire is obviously sunlight, the light of the sun. What type of sun exposure does your garden area get? Now, I'm not talking about like the overall, like the entirety of your yard, because that's a lot to think about. Think about just a very small plot where I'm going to plant these plants. What kind of sun does it get? And of course, this applies even if you have like a window that you're putting potted plants into, or a balcony or something like that. How many hours of sun does that area get in a day? Usually they break down sun exposure into four categories: full sun, part shade, and full shade. So full sun is anything that's 6 or more hours a day, especially if it gets sun in the midday. Part sun is anywhere between 4 and 6 hours, and it gets at least some sun during the midday when the sun is up above at its highest. That sun is brighter and hotter than the other sun. Part shade is when you get between 4 and 6 hours of day of sun, but it's only in the mornings, like when the sun is coming in at that flat angle, or in the evenings closer to sunset. Again, the sun's coming in more flat instead of directly above. Part shade. And then of course, full shade is anything where you get less than 4 hours of sun a day. You're going to be in the shade pretty much most of the day. Now, knowing what type of sun, of course, is going to limit what type of plants you can have. If you're planning on planting any kinds of, generally annuals, which includes your vegetables, or fruits, anything that you want to bear fruit, most of the time, all of those things are going to, if it's something that you can eat, or something that makes a lot of seeds, like sunflowers, then you're going to need to be full sun for those. The converse, however, which is interesting, is that a lot of the witchy plants, like the poisonous plants, tend to be more shade plants. So you have some options there. You know, you're not limited by what is sun or shade. You just have to be a little more creative. If you don't have that full sun, you're not going to be able to grow lavender and tomatoes, but you can grow some kick-ass hellebores and maybe even some mandrakes. So take what you got. So we've talked about fire. Water. Water is next. So water, of course, is how much rainfall are you getting in a year, and also what kind of drainage do you have. If you have an area that gets wet and stays wet for a long period of time, again, you're not going to be able to grow some of those plants that don't like wet feet. So things like lavender, rosemary, sage, they're not going to like those wet areas. If you have soil that, if you have an area that stays dry a lot, then they're going to like those things. You know, your lavender, your rosemary, your sage are going to like having those drier areas to be in, but your mints might suffer because mints like to be a little more heavily watered. Elder is another one that really likes to have water. So those are things to take into consideration. It helps if you have some familiarity with your area, and like the best garden planning honestly happens after you've been living in a home or an area for at least a year, and you get to see the whole cycle of the year and how it goes through. But sometimes even just kind of like, okay, pay attention after this rainstorm, see where the rain stays, so where, the ground stays wet for a long time, where the water runs away from very quickly. Those are things that are important to keep in mind. Now, some things in drainage are obviously going to be affected by the type of soil you have, which we'll talk about next and when we talk about earth. There are also some things that you can kind of mitigate. So for example, if you have an area that tends to stay wet, but you really want to grow that lavender, there's nothing saying that you can't build a raised bed that will drain better, or build a raised embankment that doesn't necessarily have to have a border around it. It can literally just be a hill of earth that you plant your plants on top of, or put it in pots. I grow a lot of things that don't like wet feet in pots, simply because I have a heavy clay soil and it doesn't drain well. So my rosemary's in a pot. My sage, when I try to grow them, they're in a pot. Sage doesn't like me. But yeah, so, work with what you got again. So earth, obviously, I alluded that we were going to talk about that. The type of soil that you have is going to have an impact on how your plants are going to grow. And there are some things that you can do to kind of help with that we'll talk about as well. But there's 4 basic soil types. You see how all these things happen in 4s? It's kind of interesting, isn't it? There's 4 types of sun. There's 4 soil types. Yeah. Anyway, 4 basic soil types. Clay soil. This is what I have in my yard. A clay soil. Clays are very, very fine particulate soils. Because the particles are so fine that it's very dense, and it tends to be actually really high in nutrients, but because it's so dense, the roots of the plant actually have a hard time penetrating, and they tend to be really, really, like they get really waterlogged and they stay wet for a long period of time. It just soaks up all the water and it stays in there for a long time. Clay soils, when they're dry, like you basically need a mattock or a pickaxe to get through them. And when they're wet, they are sticky, sticky, sticky. Those soils are, like I said, they're not good for plants that don't like wet feet. But next type of soil, the opposite of clay soil is a sandy soil. A sandy soil, of course, has like a sand-like texture and usually has some sort of, none of these things happen in a vacuum. It has something to do with all the alluvial soils that were deposited by glacial movements millions of years ago. But sandy soils are very fast draining, very, very fast draining. Water will just go right through them like a sieve. Unfortunately, that water will also carry away all the nutrients that might possibly be present. So sandy soils tend to be very nutrient poor. Very good for plants that don't like to stay wet. Not so great for just general planting because, again, you got to fertilize the shit out of them. Silt is the 3rd soil type. This one's less common. You usually see it on riverbanks and areas where there's been a lot of watery detritus that's just been kind of built up over years. Very fertile soils. Very fertile soils. There's a reason why the ancient Egyptian civilization was typically along the River Nile. They were planting in the silt that was deposited by that river as opposed to all the sand that was everywhere else. So yeah, a lot of fertility in these soils. They tend to be kind of sticky and hold on to water like clay does, but not quite to as severe an extent. The big thing with silt soils is that they tend to form a crust as they dry out. Like you'll actually see it form a crust and it'll actually be like cracks in the crust. That crust makes it very hard for new seeds to sprout in silt soils if they're dry. So they also tend to get really compacted really quickly, which can also make it difficult for roots to grow in there. So you take the good with the bad. The last type of soil is loam. Loam is basically the cream of the crop. That's the soil that everyone wants to have and no one actually does. It's very rare to have a true loam soil. A loam soil is actually a combination of all 3 different types of soils in the correct proportion. So a loam soil will have sand, it will have clay, it will have silt. And I think it's like 40, 40, 30, something along those lines. It'll have all three of those. But again, very few people have a true loam soil. Most people make an approximation of loam soil, and the way that we do that is by adding compost. So all of this was to say, this long ass diatribe on soil was just to basically tell you, find out what kind of soil you have and what the specific needs are associated with that soil. And then regardless of what your specific needs are, you're probably going to be adding compost in order to help alleviate some of those difficulties. So a clay soil can be lightened up and softened by using compost. Silt soil, same thing, lighten it up and soften it by using compost. The sandy soil can be that added fertility and decrease the rate at which it drains by adding compost. So add compost is basically, I really should have just summed it up with that, but what can I say? I get really into this stuff, okay? I love talking about dirt. So, anyway, our last element, we only have one element left, and it is air. Air is very abstract. You know, you think about like air, it doesn't, like there's a tangible physical quality of air that is present in our garden, and it's atmospheric air. How much CO2 is in the atmosphere? We don't have any control over that. There's some aspects of climate that we kind of have like some planning that we can do around, but air is the element of the mind. Air is the element of planning, of knowledge, of learning, of knowing what you have and figuring out how all these pieces fit together and what you can do about it. Air is present in making sure that we choose the plants that are appropriate for our growing zones, for our soil type, for our sun exposure, and for our drainage levels. Air is present in the garden design itself, making sure that things are aesthetically pleasing, making sure that plants are all visible by making sure that your smaller plants are planted towards the front of the bed and the larger plants are planted in the back. Or in the case if you have a bed that you're going to be visible from all the way around 360, large plants go in the middle, small plants on the edge. It's that simple. Spacing your plants properly. That's a big thing too. You want to make sure that the plants, every plant has its own, what we call a spread, which is how much room it will take up horizontally on the ground. And then there's a height, which is the vertical height. You want to account for that spread, that horizontal distance around when you're planting your plants next to each other, because ideally you want to have plants that are planted in such a way that their two spreads just barely overlap by a couple inches. But not much more than that, because that way you're covering up as much of the bare ground as possible with the growth of the plants, not leaving any spaces for the weeds to pop up in between, while still making sure that you have enough space that both of those plants can reach their full, you know, destined size without being stunted or crowded. So, hang on. My notes here. I had a bunch of stuff. Oh, yes. Growth and bloom time of your plants. So a lot of people will buy flowers just thinking, oh, I like this flower, I like this flower, I like this flower. And then it turns out that they buy all the things that bloom all at the same time. And they'll have 1 month where their garden looks absolutely stunning. And then the remaining 11 months out of the year, it looks like hot garbage. So, I know, Hades, give me a second. Being very so yes, take that into account. You know, it's okay to plant those flowers that you love that only bloom in May, but you might also want to look for some other things that mix it up a little bit. Get something that has, you know, a July bloom time. Get something that has a fall bloom time. Get something that has some interesting fall color. Get something that has what we call winter interest, which means that even in the winter time when it's all snowy and there's no leaves on anything, it still looks cool. Like for example, there's a red twig dogwood that I have that is kind of like, you know, it's a shrub most of the year. It has a few flowers in the springtime, which aren't super impressive. And then like in the fall, it turns this really gorgeous red color. And then in the wintertime, all the leaves fall off and you just see these stunning bare red stems poking up out of the snow. And it just looks fabulous. Winter interest. So yes. Planning out for those things to make sure that you have a garden that looks aesthetically pleasing in all 4 seasons is really cool. Interplanting your plants so that you have different things coming in at different times. That's where you put your bulbs or your spring ephemerals kind of in in between the spaces where your summer perennials are going to be, so that those spring ephemerals pop up, and then right around the time that they're dying down is when all your summer plants are really coming in. So yeah, those are all things that are basically falling under the domain of air. So, and then of course, companion planting is a big thing too. If you're doing vegetable gardening, finding out what plants like each other, because plants do have preferences as to who they're next to. There are some plants that just will cross-pollinate like pests and diseases if you plant them too close to each other, and you don't want to do that. There are some plants that just don't like each other, and then there are some plants that, like, if you plant them next to each other, they actually enhance each other's growth. For example, if they say that you can plant onions and garlic around roses, and that will help to repel the pests from the roses. So I'm going to get myself some decorative alliums to go around my roses this year, because that's been something on my wish list. So, but yes, other thing to consider too when you're thinking about the design and aesthetics that fall under air, the hardscaping. Hardscaping, if you're not familiar, is basically all the things that are in the garden that aren't a plant. So that would be the paths that you lie out, the edges of your beds, even things like gates, fences, the location of your house and how your house interplays into that, other houses surrounding you. If you want to have a decorative statue and a plinth or a bird bath, or a pole that you hang a bird feeder on, or all of those sorts of things. That's all hardscaping, and positioning of those in such a way that's aesthetically pleasing, and also making sure that the plants around it are harmonizing with that element, is a really key point of that sort of mental exercise of air. So, yeah, boy, I've really gotten off track here. Let me see. Let me look at my notes here, make sure I didn't miss anything. Oh yes, one last thing I want to mention too. Natural appearing plantings usually occur in odd numbers. So if you are planting a clump of something, like say you want to have a big clump of a plant, and you want to make it sort of natural looking, you do it in odd numbers, 3, 5, 7, 9, 13. If you plant 2 of a plant, it looks very unnatural. And anytime you have 2 of something, automatically your mind is going to be drawn to that space in between those 2 to try and look and see for what is filling in that empty space. Now you can use that to your advantage if you're intending to draw someone's attention. Say like you will plant 2 hedges on either side of the path that you want them to follow, and then they'll follow it with their eyes and maybe follow it with their feet. But if you want to have a more naturalistic looking planting, like something that just, oh look, a garden just happened, like it just happens. But yes, the way we do that, the way we make gardens look sort of more naturalistic, is by making sure that we're planting them in odd numbered clumps. So keep that in mind. Use your numerology, plant the number of plants of the number that you want to bring that energy into. So so there's that. Yeah, I think that covers all the basics that I can think of off the top of my head. This is a very extensive, very, very extensive topic. Like it's really impossible for me to do in just a short YouTube videos. Not that this video is all that short. I'm having to use my bifocals here. Yeah, we're going on 19 minutes right now, but this is a really extensive topic to go over. And I haven't even gotten into the plant choices yet. And honestly, that's not really a topic that I can go over in just garden planning. That needs its own separate topic. And it's really, really going to be very different depending on what part of the world you're in. Because there are so many different factors that are going to play into what plants you choose. But at least this will give you some idea of getting an idea of what the lay of your land is and what your limitations will will make it a lot easier for you to kind of figure out what you can do. Because obviously, if you're living in Arizona, you're not easily going to be able to grow a water garden, or a giant sequoia, or watercress, or anything else that apples, really, because they need a chill period. You have to take what you have and kind of work with the area that you have, and use you know, use the hard limits that nature is giving you to kind of figure out what you can do. Okay. But yeah, I think that that's basically going to sum it up. So yeah, know your sun, know your water, know your soil, and then make a plan from there. So anyway, that's all that I have for you. Yeah, now more than 20 minutes here. So I'm going to cut this off here. I hope this video finds you well, and I will see you again soon.